Hey YouTube, today I'm going to give you a quick video tutorial on how to install a SSD drive into your mid-2010 27-inch iMac desktop computer. Okay guys, before I go ahead and dismantle my 27-inch iMac, I'm going to just give you guys a quick demonstration on the stock 1TB Western Digital Caviar Black drive that came from the factory in my quad-core iMac. Now, right here I've got an instance of Safari open, and I'm going to hit restart, and basically upon restart we're going to see how long it takes to boot from when we see the Apple logo on the screen to get back to a instance of Safari with Google displayed on the screen. So the computer just restarted, so we're going to go ahead and start the timer now when I see the Apple logo. And just to show you guys there, it's timing away on my iPhone, and I'm going to stop this timer when I see Google's homepage. So I just stopped the timer. It took approximately 46.5 seconds to basically start from when we saw the Apple logo on the screen to being able to see Google and the graphics on Google's website. So that gives you an idea of how long a traditional spinning hard drive takes. Okay guys, so what I have here is a bunch of different applications pre-selected to start up on my iMac with the traditional 7200 RPM hard drive. So we've got Safari, iTunes, iMovie, iPhoto, GarageBand, Firefox, Adobe Photoshop CS4, Aperture, and the App Store pre-loaded. And what we're going to do is that we're going to start it up and see how long everything takes to get up and running. So essentially, when all the different icons stop bouncing is when I will stop the timer. Okay, so about 2 minutes to start up. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 to 8 applications here. Not really sure why Photoshop isn't running, but in a nutshell, regardless, it's taking forever to load, and I mean the hard drive is still going quite hard, so it just highlights that, you know, a spinning hard drive just takes an eternity to load anything. So now we're going to go ahead, install our SSD, and then we're going to run a similar barrage of tests on the same computer. Before we begin the upgrade process, we need to ensure that we have the appropriate components to install a secondary SSD drive into our iMac. First being that we have the SSD drive in a laptop form factor, which is your standard 2.5-inch drive here. In this case, I'm using a Toshiba series SSD, a 90-degree SATA cable, a genuine Apple SSD mounting bracket that can be purchased from applecomponents.com, as well as the revised power cable assembly that will also allow you to power up the next SSD drive alongside with the factory installed hard drive. So let's begin the disassembly process. The first step is to ensure that we remove the memory modules from the iMac, and this can be done so by placing the iMac onto a protected surface. In this case, it would be a table with a towel. We're going to use our Phillips #2 driver to loosen the 3 memory bank cover screws located directly in the middle, on the bottom edge of our iMac, to expose the memory bank modules. To remove the memory modules, simply locate the pull tabs on each side of the memory banks and pull firmly straight up to release the memory modules. Once the memory modules have been loosened, gently pull them out individually, making note of the orientation of the memory module and the notch. On my iMac's case, the power button is located on the right hand side here, on the right hand edge, and the cutout for the right hand side memory banks is directed to the right, and if we go to the left side, they should be in the same direction, with this notch biased more to the right hand side. With the Macintosh placed right side up again, we're going to use any type of suction cup here to pull this entire front glass panel away from the Macintosh by tipping the top portion out and then lifting it off the retaining latch tabs on the bottom of the screen. Now, some people have some pretty fancy glass pulling suction cups. I'm just simply going to use a shower foo-foo like this with a suction cup end on it that's clean, and then I'm just going to attach it to the edge, one edge of the glass, and then just gently pull to free the screen off of the magnet retainers. Once I've pulled it away from the frame, using your hands, gently pull this glass assembly away from the magnets on the upper edge and lift the glass panel completely off the computer. Using a T10 screwdriver, we will need to remove 8 screws retaining the LCD monitor panel to the chassis. 4 of them will be located on the left side, located 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the other 4 is located in the exact locations on the opposite side, 1, 2, 3, 4. Occasionally the screws will stick inside the chassis due to the strong, high-powered magnetic nature of these retaining tabs that hold the glass panel onto the chassis. So it's useful to have a magnetized screwdriver tip or some spudgers handy to help aid the removal of these screws. So ever so carefully, preferably with the help or the extra hands of an assistant, bring the computer right side up again, making sure that you actually hold the screen with your hands in this manner so that the screen doesn't fall out of the chassis once the screws have been removed. And the reason why is that there's nothing securing it to the chassis, so if you drop this and break this panel, you're going to have to spend a lot of money buying a new one from Apple, if not right off your computer altogether. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a little plastic spudger tool here and just pry away at this edge to just lift this panel away from the chassis here. And basically there's just enough give that you can tip the screen out about this much before we actually have to reach inside to disconnect a few cables. So once we've tipped the screen out just a few centimeters, you'll see that there's a cable here that's kind of glued up against the top left side of our screen here and the back side. I'm not sure how well you guys can see this, but we want to take our hand and just gently peel this LCD backlight cable away from the back of the Mac. And once you do that, it'll allow you to tip the screen forward a little bit further and allow you to use your other hand to just gently unplug that cable, which is the LCD backlighted cable, from the connector itself, which is located here. To disconnect this cable, you can either use your hands to gently pull it up and away, or you can use your spudger tool to loosen it. But the whole idea is that you want to be careful not to damage this connector on the logic board itself or the power supply. And we're going to do this by taking our time to disconnect everything. And that's what the disconnected connector looks like. Then what we can do is that we can continue ever so carefully tipping the screen forward to reach down into this region here, which is going to be the display data cable, which is also sort of partially glued onto the frame here. And then we're going to want to carefully tip this further out and squeeze the sides of the connector with our hands, and then unplugging this data cable. And that's what those tabs look like. You have to squeeze them with your hands like this. The next cable is the LCD temperature sensor cable, which is located right in the middle of the computer assembly. That's the LCD temperature cable. And then last but not least, the actual screen power connector located here off the power supply board by prying away this tab and then just removing this cable. Now the trick here, guys, is that whenever you're disconnecting this screen is to have another pair of hands to assist, or to simply just take your time removing everything. Now I'm not even going to in fact remove the screen out of the chassis in the manner that it's been disconnected through the front. Because of the weighting of this screen, the whole body will end up tipping up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to support the screen like this with my fingers and then place the unit back on a flat surface and then carefully remove the panel assembly like this out of my Mac. Now let's do a quick recap here on what these connectors look like. So here we actually have our LCD power cable. We have the backlight cable that we disconnected earlier, and this is the one you have to be really careful on because it's really fine and delicate. We have our screen data cable that actually sends the video information from the logic board to the screen, and then of course the actual LCD temperature sending cable, which is this tiny little 2-pin connector here. So this is what the insides of a 27-inch iMac mid-2010 looks like once the glass panel and the LCD display assembly have been removed from the chassis. So the couple things to point out here is that we have our LCD backlight driver board here, we have our primary power supply located here, our hard drive, our CPU heatsink, optical drive, various cooling fans located in these areas, as well as the main logic port located in this region. And this is also our Wi-Fi airport card here. So once we're inside our Mac, we need to disconnect our power cable from our hard drive, the SATA data cable here, as well as Apple's funky proprietary temperature sensor cable located here. Now it's really important that we note the orientation of where this actual connector is and the pinouts, because this will ultimately govern the hard drive fan speed. And so we want to make sure that we put this back in the right position. So to remove it, I'm just going to use my little spudger tool here just to carefully pry this off of the pins. And it's worth mentioning that on my iMac at least, that the gray cable is on top of the black cable as how it plugs into here. Next, we can then take our T10 Torx screwdriver to remove the hard drive screws located here and here, and actually remove the hard drive assembly completely out of the iMac, like this. Now, as a good rule of thumb, whenever you're disconnecting anything from your computer, sometimes it's a wise idea to replace the screws that you had just removed so that you don't lose them. I can't tell you how many screws are inside an iMac, but there's a lot, so you can't really afford to screw up where they all go. And that's what it looks like. The next step is remove the optical CD drive by removing the screws located here, 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 and here. And they also are T10 screws. And you just lift this entire assembly up and out of the computer. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that we do have our data cable connector located here, which we will be able to disconnect by using our spudger and just kind of prying it off. But to also pay attention that there's a temperature sensing cable located here as well. And we don't need to actually remove that off the drive. We can actually go ahead and disconnect it from the logic board by pulling it straight out this way on the board. And I'm just going to use our spudger tool to give me assistance to disconnect it. Now, for those that are wondering if the direction matters, yes it does, I'm sure, like anything on these computers. So what we're going to do is just mention that the gray cable is in the lower position relative to the black cable. And this is how that comes out. We want to now remove this fan by removing this T10 screw holding it to the chassis, and then ever so carefully lift this assembly up like this, exposing the fan, And then in that process, we also want to disconnect this connector for the fan located underneath the RMT input-output cable. And again, just carefully using your spudger tool and your fingers, pull that connector by pulling it out this way. This is what it looks like. Next, we're going to remove the main power supply board, which is located here, and that can be accomplished by taking out the 4 T10 Torx screws located here, 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 and here, as well as disconnecting the main logic board power connector here, as well as the accessory power connection here. Now it's worth mentioning, guys, that the screws on the power supply differ slightly in such a manner that looking at the iMac from this perspective, where the hard drive is here, the 2 screws closest to the hard drive are the short, fine-threaded variants here, and then the screw closest to the CPU heatsink assembly is a coarse-threaded long screw, and then the screw closest to the top edge of our iMac is just a standard T10 short screw like this one. Once we've undone all the screws, we can carefully lift this power supply assembly out of the chassis, and we're going to have to be very careful that we don't damage anything or pay attention to any extra connectors. It is worth mentioning here that there's a little plastic divider board that sits between the power supply and the LCD board. But we're just going to have to finesse this and play around with it for it to all come apart properly. Now, because there are studs on the power supply board, it can be a little bit stiff in removal. So just have some patience when you're doing your disconnection work. Now, to unplug the main power connector, we just simply pinch on that tab and then ever so carefully wiggle this connector off. Like that. And then also just pinch this connector here underneath this piece of Scotch tape looking plastic. Disconnect it like this, and then just pull this entire power assembly out like that. The next component that needs to come out is the LCD backlight power supply board, which is located right beside the power supply. And much like the power supply, it's held in with a bunch of standard T10 screws located here, 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 and here, as well as the actual main board power connector. And then to disconnect it, simply press down on this connector and then unplug it. Once the LCD power board and power supply have been removed, remove this plastic divider off of the chassis. The next step is to remove the airport card, and this can be accomplished by disconnecting the 2 antenna feed leads here and then unscrewing these 2 screws retaining this entire board assembly, and then getting underneath the cellophane tape on the logic board to disconnect it. Using a spudger tool, just go underneath the connector and just gently pry up on the gray antenna leads. Unscrew the 2 retaining screws using your Torx T10 screwdriver. And then carefully peel back the cellophane tape retaining this connector on our logic board. And you want to try to be able to reuse this tape if possible later on. But what we're going to do here is just peel it back enough so that we can expose this connector so that we can actually just disconnect it. By getting your spudger tool and lifting this connector straight up off the board like this. Remove the airport assembly. The infrared receiver board is tucked behind this Apple logo on the chassis. So how we're going to get to it is we're going to peel this cellophane tape back on the logic board to expose some of the wiring. Use our finger and a spudger to pull that connector straight back. Once we've unplugged the IR receiver module, we can just go ahead and reach our fingers into this region and just ever so carefully pull out the IR receiver board, which is this assembly here. So now there are eight screws holding this logic board to the chassis, and so the screws are located 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to carefully disconnect all these cables here that are on the logic board and mark them if you need to, or at least take a photograph of it beforehand, and then proceed to undo the 8 screws holding this logic board to the chassis itself. So I'm going to begin by disconnecting all the necessary cables that haven't already been disconnected. And we can do this by simply using our spudger tool and our fingernail. Just carefully unplug each connector, paying careful attention to the orientation of these connectors. Some pull straight up, but most of them on the iMac fortunately just pull straight out. But you shouldn't need too much force to do any disconnection work. You don't want to break a connector on the logic board itself. There's also the left and right speaker cables located right here. Don't worry about the orientation of these cables because they can only go in one direction. Like so. Our SD card reader cable, which is located here. And this is our microphone cable located here. And our RMT I/O cable, which is located here. So we can tuck that up out of the way. And as well as the other fan connector, which is located in this region here. CPU fan specifically, for those that are wondering. And then another little connector here. So before I try to lift this out, I noticed that there's a couple other sensor cables I didn't disconnect. This one being the skin temperature sensor. The hard drive one you don't need to necessarily disconnect because it's already been disconnected here from the hard drive assembly. And just before you do any type of lifting work, just make sure that you go through and double check everything prior to lifting the logic board assembly out of the computer assembly. So if everything is done properly, you should be able to ever so slightly pick up your logic board with the highest level of care and remove it from your computer like so. Now on the underside of the logic board here, we can sort of tip this up and change our view. We can see that there's all these different connectors that are still attached to the logic board. And that's fine, guys. We just need to make sure that we untuck this cable assembly located here on our computer and just lift this cable out like such. And then what we can do is that we can gently turn this around so that we can see what the logic board looks like. Okay. This is the particular piece that is going to be replaced with that new bracket assembly that we had purchased from applecomponents.com. Now my video, unlike some of the other YouTube videos, I don't actually just use the OWC kit where they just kind of jam it in a spot under the logic board or wherever the install process requires. I'm actually buying the genuine Apple bracket that would have shipped with a build-to-order configuration from the factory to have the SSD properly mounted in this region. So in order for us to remove this, we're just going to remove the single T10 screw here holding this, what they call wall assembly, inside the iMac, and just ever so carefully pull it off from the inside of the iMac. Now you want to be super careful when we're doing this because there's a whole bunch of cables that sort of run over this little area, and so what we're going to actually do is use our spudger tool to carefully peel up some of this adhesive tape to give the cable a little more give, so that we don't inadvertently rip some cables apart on our Mac. It is that aluminum foil tape, so be prepared for it to actually tear. But in a nutshell, it will come off with some coercing. That's all we really need from a clearance standpoint. So then, this bracket assembly will actually just peel right off with a little bit of force because it is held in with some double-sided tape adhesive. So we're just going to work this wall assembly right off like such, turn it 90 degrees, and then ever so carefully remove it from the computer. And that's what that wall assembly piece looks like on a non-built-to-order SSD 27-inch iMac configuration. So since we're in here and we've removed the bracket and I've cleaned off some of the excess adhesive from the old bracket, I can take some compressed air just to dust out the inside. So we'll prepare the SSD bracket and the SSD drive as an assembly by orienting the bracket where the top hole is and your SSD bracket where the contacts are, and then just lining up the holes on your bracket and using a very flat profile screw, assemble your SSD into the bracket holder assembly. You don't want to use standard screws necessarily because what's going to happen is you won't have sufficient clearance on the bracket itself when you try to re-adhere it to the iMac chassis with this double-sided tape. So just make sure that you try to find screws that look like this with flat heads on them to attach your SSD to the bracket. So before we install the new bracket onto the iMac, we want to just make sure that we press down on our foil tape here that we had peeled up earlier and just reattach it carefully to our iMac body. And then we want to route these cables underneath the mount, whereas on the old mount it went over, and how you can tell is that this spot here is where the cables will peek through. So we want to trial fit this bracket on to make sure that it clears with your screws properly and there's no bulging or binding. And in our case right now it fits perfectly. So what we can do is peel off the double-sided tape on our bracket, making sure that underneath this region here is clean. I actually used a little bit of alcohol earlier to wipe the surfaces and prep everything so that it sticks nice and firmly. You don't have to. And then in a nutshell, what we want to do is peel away all this adhesive backing tape. And then carefully install our bracket, while lining up the cables, by the way, guys, into the iMac chassis as such. So we can see here that there's a little cutout for that cable. We just want to press firmly onto our bracket. It might not sit 100% smack on perfectly initially until we screw everything down. And just screw firmly. It's plastic parts, so they can break if you overdo it. But basically, just give it a good press. Press everywhere except the SSD to ensure that the adhesive bonds to the chassis. And that's what an SSD installed from the factory would look like using the factory Apple bracket assembly. So with our logic board laid out here on a piece of cardboard, what we want to do is disconnect the old logic board cable by lifting up on this tab with a spudger tool and then just disconnecting it from our logic board. And then when we remove this cable, we just need to pay attention that these cables here are also sort of tied together with some scotch tape looking like material, which needs to be undone like this. And this is cable wrap, it looks like. And basically we're going to free the old power cable from the logic board. And so these are some of the differences between the old cable versus the new cable. So the old cable here, this is the logic board connector, and then there's a single power cable end for our traditional hard drive. And then this is the portion that plugs into the power supply and then ultimately into the LCD powering board. This revised cable assembly here actually looks very similar, with the exception that you can tell that there's an additional SATA power cable end right here. So our hard drive would plug here, and then our SSD would be plugged into here. So what we want to do is we want to remove the old power cable, set it aside. We also want to grab our SATA data cable here, and we want to plug this onto our logic board right now by lifting up and then plugging not the angled end but the straight end onto our SATA connector on the motherboard, or logic board, sorry. Just plug that down firmly, and then that needs to route alongside our new power cable. So our power cable is going to plug into the logic board connector, and then what we're going to do is we're going to tightly route these cables as such against the existing power cable. And how we're going to accomplish this is we're actually going to use that plastic film tape that we had removed earlier, and we're going to use it to rewrap the new cables together. Now you don't have to do this step, but I'm particular about how I do my work, so I'm going to do it this way. And this is what the final product should look like once your rerouting has been done properly. Now just always double check, don't press down on your logic board and flex it because you could damage some traces on the actual board itself. So we just want to make sure that everything is firmly plugged in, and then we can now go ahead and proceed to reinstall this logic board into the computer. Reinstall the logic board, paying careful attention to all the various wire harnesses and connectors to make sure that they don't get inadvertently buried underneath the logic board, and then you're going to be struggling to reconnect. Now it may take some time to realign everything properly inside your Mac. However, taking the time to pay attention to where everything's installed now will alleviate any confusion and missing cables later on down the road. So the logic board has been properly aligned. Reinstall all the various screws that were removed that were retaining the logic board in the first place. It's worth mentioning that we don't want to necessarily tighten down the screws completely yet, but just loosely install them until everything has been properly aligned. Once everything's been screwed in, give the logic board just a few shifts back and forth in an attempt to best line up the screw holes to their former positions. Okay, so now we've carefully aligned everything on our logic board as per how it was initially disassembled. So now we get to have the fun task of reconnecting all of our cable assemblies here. So if you've got bad memory, then you might have a problem if you didn't write these all down, but I fortunately do know where these all go. So I'm just going to take my time to reconnect everything. There's no rush in doing any of this. So in a nutshell, just plug everything back in the way it was removed originally. Okay guys, so just a quick recap here. We've got our RMT IO cable here, right? We've got the optical disk drive temperature cable that came off with our drive, as well as the optical disk drive fan connector that's underneath in this region. But I also want to point out that we have our SD card reader connector, left and right speaker. On this side here, we have our CPU fan connector, which is really important, as well as a, if I remember correctly here, this is a temperature sensor probe right here. So those two connect up. We have our skin fan, or skin temperature sensor, which is up in this region. We have our hard drive temperature sensor. We have our eyesight camera, or our FaceTime camera. We've got a whole host of all these different connectors, ambient sensor, ambient temperature sensor, as well as, if I can't see this one, but basically all these different connectors up here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 LCD temperature sensor, as well as the cable, remember guys, it came off when we pulled the screen off, so those two can be left blank. Left and right speaker, we have our microphone plug here, SD reader here, RMT IO cable there, fan and optical disk drive temperature sensors there. So there's no other cables that need to be plugged in. We now are going to proceed to install all the other pieces that we had pulled off earlier. Okay, so now we need to plug in the power cable for the SSD drive. So the one wire here with the 4 wires is actually the one that goes on the hard drive, and this terminating end with 2 is actually the one for the SSD. So one of the struggles that we're going to have here, because of the limited space inside this area, is getting this connector onto the SSD somehow. So I think the easiest way here is just to fold this cable over and try our very best to finesse this cable onto the SSD's connector. Now, take your time with this, get a spudger tool, get an extra set of hands if need be, but you're just going to have to take your time to plug this bad boy on. So guys, after a little bit of fidgeting with my spudger tool here, I managed to plug on that power connector for my SSD, and as you can tell, there's almost barely any room to be working in here. So that's what that connector looks like. The next step here is to take our secondary SSD cable right here and actually plug that data connector cable onto the SSD data port, like so. Now you might want to just get your spudger tool to double check to make sure that's plugged on nice and firmly on their drive. You can always turn your computer sideways and just making sure that that connector is sitting perpendicular to the face of the drive. So now the next step is to continue installing our other pieces that we had removed earlier. Next, we're going to reinstall our infrared receiver board ever so carefully onto our computer by just sliding that in until it seats. We're going to reinstall the LCD backlight and main power supply boards into our chassis, but before doing so, make sure you insert the plastic separator board and then just drop the power supply back in for our board. And we're using our screwdriver to reinstall the LCD backlight board. Now, like with all boards, I always encourage people to just loosely install them first to give you a little bit of slack to shift things around if necessary. Just use common sense when you're installing things. So I know I had mentioned earlier that we're going to install our power supply boards, but now actually might be a good time as well, guys, just to route your cables back to the retaining clips located around the logic board area, so that all your cables are nice and secured tightly on our unit. So, for example, right here, we've got our power supply unit, and then we've got this power connector for the LCD backlight. So I'm just going to plug that on here now. But prior to doing that, I just want to emphasize that you want to give some slack or some free space to where all these cables are being routed, so that you're not kinking your cables and inadvertently damaging them. In a nutshell, once you've roughly clipped everything in, you can always double check the fitment of everything, making sure that it's not pinching any cables where it shouldn't be on your computer. So this is what a rough clip-in would look like, and you can see the cables are routed around these plastic points as necessary. So next is our power supply board. Which will just drop into place like this. And just right now, while you have it unscrewed, let's just plug this in. Install the power supply board screws. And then reconnecting our 2-pin power connector right here. Then tucking that wire into this little groove here. And then putting everything back together like this. And then taping this assembly back down. Like so. So I forgot to mention that we can peel this backer off of the LCD backlight board assembly and then just ever so carefully tape this wire assembly back down above these air vents, because we don't want to block those vents for ventilation purposes. And the reason why we tape this down is to just give everything a tidy installed look. Next, reinstall the airport wireless receiver assembly. Reinstall the antennas by pressing down on the little connectors. To reattach the airport wireless, and that just attaches simply by pressing down on this connector like this, and then making sure that you apply this tape to tape that connector right down and then fold it underneath onto the logic board so it doesn't have an opportunity to pop out. Next step here is to reinstall our hard drive, and so basically what we want to do is plug in our temperature sensor right here with the gray wire pointing up, our data cable right here, and our power cable here. And then ever so slightly, or ever so carefully I should say, just gently tuck the studs in on our hard drive into the retaining grommets, which is located here. And then from there, reattach them with the Torx screws. So now, we can now install our optical disk drive cooling fan, which belongs in this region here. And we're going to have to just carefully align those pegs on the fan assembly, making sure that these walls all line up correctly, and then screw the lone Torx bolt down, and then reconnecting that fan via this connector under the RMT I/O cable. Install the optical disk drive, plugging back in our SATA cable, and just dropping the drive down into the drive bay area and lining it up with the pegs on the side of our iMac, like so. Don't forget to also reinstall the optical temperature sensor cable, which you can just simply tuck in behind in this region and reattach it just by the RMT cable assembly. We've now essentially installed probably 90% of our Mac. So now we're just going to take the time to drop in our screen into the chassis, and then we'll power it up before reinstalling the glass panel. Now to reinstall our LCD panel, we're just going to carefully align this and drop our panel in, at least in the interim, so that these electrical pads touch with this little point here. We're going to reconnect the LCD backlight power connector here. And again guys, it always helps to have a helper hold things because you don't want to drop this and then break it. Hook up our LCD temperature sensing cable. We can then go ahead and plug in our data cable like this. Let's push that in, make sure it's nice and firm. And then last but not least, we're going to plug in our other cable right here. That was meant for LCD. We just double checked everything. There's 4 cables. Your data cable, temp cable, power cable, and I believe brightness cable, if that's what it's called. So we're just going to sandwich this back up into our chassis like this, and then ever so carefully lay our Mac back on its back side, and we can now begin reinstalling the 8 screws holding the screen to the chassis. So now that we've loosely installed the 8 screws, we can go ahead and just hand tighten the 4 screws on each side of our LCD screen. Once we've taken the liberty of taking our time to clean our LCD panel on the back side of our glass screen protector, carefully reinstall the screen in the notches on your Mac, then ever so carefully line up your screen so that it locks back into place. So take notice, guys, of the little alignment notches inside our RAM bays. So I had mentioned earlier that the notch is more biased towards the power switch when the Mac is facing screen down, so you need to pay attention to this notch and how that aligns inside the RAM bays. So to install memory, we just firmly press on the edges of the RAM . And once everything's pressed in, it should sit nice and evenly like this, and then we can just take our little memory puller tabs and we just kind of tuck them back in inside the memory bay, and then we can then proceed to reinstall our memory cover on the bottom side of our Mac. And power up our computer to see if she blows up, and if she doesn't, then we can then go ahead and reinstall the operating system. Okay guys, so now that we've got our freshly installed Toshiba SSD, we're going to do the exact test that I had showed you earlier in the video with the reboot and boot up and the loading of an instance of Safari with Google loaded up. Start our timer. And basically 7 seconds to get into Safari, and probably a few seconds for the actual wireless adapter to get into Google. So it seems to be an issue where I don't know if the computer just simply boots up so fast that I'm able to get into the desktop faster than it can acquire an IP address for an internet connection. But anyways, regardless, that is the time difference. 46 seconds, give or take a few seconds, versus just under 8 seconds to accomplish nearly the same task. I know that the Wi-Fi connectivity took a second there to catch on, but it couldn't have been more than another 5 seconds at most. Okay guys, so now that we've installed our 256GB SSD and reinstalled all the applications that we used to run our previous test with the original rotating hard drive, let's see how the SSD fares up in terms of application load times. I'm going to start it when I hit open, and then I'm going to stop the timer when all the icons stop bouncing indicating that they've loaded into memory. So about 5 seconds and 52, or 5 seconds and 52 milliseconds, iMovie is bouncing around because, well, there's no content in it, but basically 5:52, less than 6 seconds to load absolutely everything on my computer, including Final Cut Pro and iPhoto, which use external data sources to gather its information. So it just highlights the speed and power of what solid state drives have over a traditional rotating spinning platter hard drive. But regardless, you guys now know what the performance was like before and after an SSD install, and sort of the entire process in between of how to do it. So I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe, guys.